these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths. With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
He did promise America first. That's what Hillary Clinton wrote on Twitter in response to the news that the United States had the most coronavirus cases in the world. That's what she wrote, almost gleefully, that it was somehow Trump's fault and that she would write that snidely on her Twitter account. Of course, she wasn't the only one with over-the-top bad faith accusations. A recent NBC News column asserted that President Trump is, quote, putting the health of the stock market over that of millions of Americans, end quote. Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin hyperbolically stated that, quote, many of these deaths will be the minimum price we pay for Trump's utter incompetence and willful blindness. Nancy Pelosi started this week off accusing President Trump of delay and denial in addressing the coronavirus. This has been the norm. This is what you've been hearing constantly from the left-wing media and my Democrat colleagues, that somehow this natural disaster is the fault of one person, that he willfully ignored it. We're going to ask if this question is true. We're going to examine in excruciating detail on this podcast every single piece of data and timeline, who was saying what and when, and who was taking action when. And an honest look about what we actually knew and when. And that's important. I mean, that's really important because I want to make something clear. Throughout this podcast, as you hear me expose the hypocrisy of the left, I'm not actually blaming the left for this either. The same way I didn't blame the Obama administration for H1N1 or Ebola. Thousands and thousands of Americans died in H1N1. You didn't hear Republicans putting those deaths at the feet of President Obama. It would be easy to use very disingenuous arguments against the Obama administration and say, well, they lived through those disasters. They could have supplied us with more PPE, supplied us with more ventilators. They should have seen this coming. But that wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair. They didn't have the data to justify that. We can't always know what's going to happen. We have to, if we're going to criticize each other, we have to be able to do it objectively, with the facts and data that were presented to people at the time of the decision. And that grace, that generosity and understanding has been totally lacking in our public discourse. It's been disgusting. And so I'm going to give you a timeline today of exactly what you need to know to battle back these false talking points. Let's start off with how the political media has been echoing Pelosi's talking points as well. And let's look at a few headlines. The Washington Post, 2 days ago on April 1st, the Washington Post ran a report titled 33 Times Trump Downplayed the Coronavirus. Now, of course, they would have every right to run something like that, right? Because they've been sounding the alarm on coronavirus from the very beginning. Oh, wait, no, they haven't. Here's another headline from February 1st. Get a grip, America. The flu is a much bigger threat than coronavirus for now. Oh, that's interesting. Axios, same thing. Last month ran an article about President Trump's delusional and possibly disastrous fixation with treating the coronavirus like just another winter flu. Here's the thing. Back on January 29th, Axios ran a story under the headline, Why We Panic About Coronavirus But Not the Flu, which goes on to say that, quote, our newfound hypervigilance about infections might be more helpful if we could redirect some of it toward influenza, a significantly deadlier virus that strikes every year. CNN, your favorite news organization, they ran a story last month under the headline, Trump finally takes the coronavirus emergency seriously. Well, CNN being so serious and so full of good news. Yeah. The thing is, they were much more concerned about what to actually call the virus. CNN's Jim Acosta went on television and said that President Trump calling the virus the Chinese coronavirus was, quote, going to come across to a lot of Americans as smacking of xenophobia. And the amnesia must be especially strong with CNN because back in January, they had no problem calling it that, even tweeting on January 21st that a new Chinese coronavirus, a cousin of the SARS virus, has infected more than 200 people since the outbreak began in Wuhan, China in December. Look, the bottom line here is the media has been accusing President Trump of downplaying the coronavirus when they were telling Americans to, quote, get a grip over their fears about the virus. The media slammed President Trump for comparing the coronavirus to the flu when they did so themselves. And the media accused the president of not taking the coronavirus seriously when the one thing they were most seriously concerned with was what we should call the virus, ignoring their own hypocrisy. And again, the reality is, at these places in time, this was the data that we all had. It was. And a little bit of grace would be nice. And doing away with the hypocrisy would be nice. I'm not blaming CNN I'm not blaming Axios or Washington Post for running those headlines. For the information we all had at the time, those were fair questions to be posing. But to come back now and to say that the president wasn't taking it seriously, that is pure and utter hypocrisy. Let's not forget, in places like South Korea, Iran, and Italy, the sharp spike in cases and deaths didn't really start until the latest of February and early March. Okay? So we're going to go through a timeline here. We're going to go through a timeline on what actually has been done at the administration. And we're going to simultaneously look at what Democrats were focusing on. These same Democrats who are so sure of themselves that President Trump is responsible for the deaths of Americans. January 6th. Start back there. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, issued a travel notice for Wuhan, China due to the spreading virus. This was back in January 6th. Most Americans didn't know about this at all. January 7th, CDC established a COVID-19 incident management system. January 8th, CDC alerted clinicians to look out for patients with respiratory symptoms and a history of travel to Wuhan, China. So we're just getting an understanding of this. The CDC is concerned about it. They're aware of it. But right now, it's just in China. It hasn't really spread. January 14th, the World Health Organization repeats a Chinese claim that there wasn't human-to-human transmission. So the World Health Organization, as late as January 14th, was saying that this couldn't even be spread in human-to-human contact. So again, not surprising that around the world, a lot of people weren't really taking it seriously. The data wasn't out. China, of course, was hiding all of this. They knew better. They knew that it could be spread. They were freaking out internally, but we couldn't see that because, well, they're a communist government and we can't always see what's going on in China. On January 15th, the first coronavirus case arrives in Washington state with a patient returning to the state from Wuhan, China. This is interesting. What was Speaker Pelosi doing on this particular day on January 14th? This was the day she was handing out those fancy pens in a celebration ceremony for a partisan-led impeachment. That's right. That was the big focus. It's, given our news cycle, that seems like years ago, but it wasn't. That was the day that our first patient arrived in Washington. January 17th, the CDC began implementing public health entry screenings at the 3 U.S. airports that received the most travelers from Wuhan: San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. Additionally, the CDC activated its Emergency Operations Center to better provide ongoing support to the COVID-19 response. So now we're actually taking some actions. We're doing health screenings at our 3 major airports. January 20th, Dr. Fauci announces the National Institutes of Health is already working on the development of a vaccine for the coronavirus. Well, that's good news, too. Keep in mind, too, that throughout January and February, the Intelligence Committee in the House, led by Adam Schiff, was getting briefings on this stuff. But they were too busy hiring additional personnel to deal with impeachment. They didn't hold any hearings on this, nothing. But they were getting briefings. What did they do with those briefings? Nothing. January 24th, the Trump administration holds a briefing for the full Senate on coronavirus. But as Politico reported, the classified session was sparsely attended because it was held on the same day as a deadline for senators to submit their impeachment questions. January 27th, the CDC issued a level 3 travel health notice urging Americans to avoid all non-essential travel to China due to the coronavirus. January 29th, the White House announced the formation of the coronavirus task force to help monitor and contain the spread of the virus and provide updates to the president. You all remember this, right? This was one of the first times I think the media even noticed that there was something called the coronavirus or COVID-19 because they were really mad that the task force, that's right, wasn't diverse enough. That was run by CNN, by this supposed journalist named Brandon Tensley. The headline read, "Coronavirus Task Force, another example of Trump administration's lack of diversity." Yeah, that's how serious they took it back then. This was January 30th. So the Trump administration and the CDC had already implemented health screenings by this point. They'd set up their operations centers, and they'd began a task force already. Even though, really, we only had one patient coming in from China into Washington. Again, we knew about, we tested positive January 20th. They arrived January 15th, and the CDC acknowledged that was a positive case by January 20th. Only a week later, there's already a task force set up. The media's response, the task force is racist. January 31st, the Trump administration declared the coronavirus a public health emergency. This is back in January. Declared the coronavirus a public health emergency, announced a Chinese travel restriction, and suspended entry into the United States for foreign nationals who pose a risk of transmitting the coronavirus. What was Speaker Pelosi's response to this? The same day, she actually promoted a bill called the No Ban Act, which would limit the president's ability to impose travel restrictions just like this one. Just like this restriction that experts now say saved countless lives and gave us way more time to deal with the coronavirus. People need, this is such an important point. The president's still been getting smacked around for this travel restriction. You know, Vice President Biden was criticizing him for this just a couple weeks ago, even as late as a couple weeks ago. This is insanity. As President Trump restricted travel from China, for the sole reason because there's a coronavirus coming out of China, Speaker Pelosi promotes a bill called the No Ban Act. So she's directly in confrontation with this policy that saved lives. If this isn't the story of 2020, I don't know what is. On February 4th, President Trump pledged in his State of the Union address to take all necessary steps to safeguard our citizens from the threat of coronavirus. Again, this is back in February 4th. A lot of Americans are barely aware of the coronavirus at this point. And maybe Speaker Pelosi would have taken it all more seriously, but the thing is she didn't get to keep her copy of the State of the Union speech because she ripped it up right after the president was done speaking. We all remember that. February 24th, the Trump administration requests at least $2.5 billion from Congress to help combat the spread of the virus. I remember this one really well because this was really the first time that I saw any Democrats talk about coronavirus. But the way they talked about it, they were just mad that President Trump was asking for $2.5 billion. They immediately jumped to the chance to virtue signal and say, "Oh, how could you be so heartless as to only ask for $2.5 billion? You should ask for $8 billion." I remember the president thinking or saying out loud, "Fine, give me more money. That sounds great, but get it to me fast." Of course, and you would think that given the vitriolic reaction that occurred after the president requested that emergency supplemental appropriation, you would think that what would have immediately happened was the Democrats would have, because they were so angry about this, they would have come up with that $8 billion bill right away. You know, would have come up the next day and we would have voted on it. I kept wondering at the time, okay, when are we going to vote on this? You guys are really mad about this. Seems like you've got a lot of passion behind this one. Maybe we should vote on it quickly. So February 25th comes around. And by the way, this is the first time that Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, posted anything publicly about the coronavirus. This is the first time. His committee had been receiving intelligence briefings on the threat constantly, but this was the first time he actually did anything. February 28th, he didn't even do anything, by the way. He just tweeted about it once. They were 100% focused on impeachment. This was never on their radar. They can claim otherwise all they want. It was never on their radar. They never said a dang thing. February 28th, after spending that entire week, like I said, slamming President Trump for his response to the coronavirus, which the Democrats apparently had just discovered, you would think they would have a bill right away. But of course, that wasn't what we voted on that week. And if you recall the videos that I put out explaining this to people, on February 28th, we did take up legislation. So it's not fair to say that we didn't take up any legislation. But here's the legislation the Democrats put on the House floor. H.R. 2339, the Reversing the Youth Tobacco Epidemic Act. Okay, what does that actually mean? It means they banned flavored tobacco. They banned all flavored tobacco, which is a whole other discussion in and of itself, right? But just to let you know, that was the priority on February 28th. As President Trump was asking for billions of dollars to fight the pandemic from Congress, Nancy Pelosi put on the House floor a bill to ban flavored tobacco. February 29th, the Trump administration announces a level 4 travel advisory to the areas of Italy and South Korea. Bars all travel to Iran and the entry of foreign citizens who visited Iran in the last 14 days. Again, like I said before, late February, early March was really when this was taking off in Italy, Iran, South Korea. This is the information we all had. If we're all being fair to each other, media, Democrats, Republicans, there was a lot of things we didn't know. But it's fully false to say that the administration wasn't acting on these things well before the rest of us were catching up. March 4th, the Trump administration announced the purchase of approximately 500 million N95 respirators over the next 18 months to respond to the outbreak of the novel coronavirus. This is back on March 4th. The same day, Secretary Azar announced that HHS was transferring $35 million to the CDC to help state and local communities that have been impacted most by the coronavirus. March 6th, President Trump signs we finally got this bill passed. President Trump signs the $8 billion bill passed by Congress to fight the coronavirus outbreak. The bill provided almost $8 billion to federal, state, and local agencies to combat the coronavirus and another $500 million in waivers for Medicare telehealth restrictions. March 10th, President Trump and Vice President Pence met with top health insurance companies and secured a commitment to waive copays for coronavirus testing. What else was happening on March 10th? Well, Speaker Pelosi, in very woke fashion, she called Republicans bigots for referring to the virus based on its origin in China. See, at this point, this was the big debate. Nancy Pelosi said on Twitter on March 10th, bigoted statements which spread misinformation and blame Asians and the Asian American community for coronavirus make us all less safe. I won't get into how absurd that is, really. I think you all know how absurd that is. Nobody's blaming Asian Americans. That's her words. Nobody else said that. There's a long history of using a geographic tag for any kind of virus based on its origin. Ebola is the case. MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So this is normal, but this was their thing at the time. This is what they were most concerned about, this kind of virtue signaling. They were not concerned about the economy. They were not concerned about how to actually battle the epidemic. On March 13th, President Trump declared a national emergency in order to access $42 billion in existing funds to combat the virus. On March 18th, President Trump signed the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act, a second coronavirus relief bill that was passed by Congress, which provided free testing and paid sick leave for workers impacted by the virus. We would soon find out that this would be nearly irrelevant with what we would pass in the $2 trillion rescue package. And this is when negotiations began for the real issue, which was the devastation of our economy, the absolute devastation. When you pause the economy, we've talked about this in past podcasts, when you pause the economy, it has severe consequences, worse consequences than any time in our history. We had just had 10 million unemployment applications in the last couple of weeks. That's historic. It's unprecedented. And there were actually good faith conversations happening in the Senate. I remember Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about that Saturday before it all blew up. He was on television applauding the bipartisan progress being made to move fast on that third package. Not a stimulus package, not a bailout package, more of a rescue, a sustainment package. Making sure that we could provide funding to our businesses, large and small, so that they could maintain payroll. That's the most important thing at a time like this. When we're telling people to stop operating, well, we've got to keep fuel in the tank of the economy. Okay, well, then what happened? Again, these negotiations were going quite well. Speaker Pelosi flew in to to Washington, D.C. from California and completely blew up those negotiations. I've already gone into detail on other podcasts on exactly what happened there and just the absolute bad faith actions that occurred. Frank, I have called that some of the worst moment in recent political history, and I stand by that. It's the list of progressive items that she wanted to add to that bill. In the words of Representative Clyburn, the majority whip in the House, in order to fundamentally reshape the vision for this country and use this crisis as a way to do it. That's what happened. That's what happened. Meanwhile, the Trump administration was announcing that HHS would place an order for hundreds of millions of N95 masks through FEMA. And of course, since that time, FEMA has distributed millions and millions of masks. March 23rd, President Trump signed an executive order invoking Section 4512 of the Defense Production Act to prohibit the hoarding of vital medical supplies. And Vice President Pence announces that over 300,000 Americans were tested for the coronavirus and have received results. So we drastically ramped up our testing during this time. FEMA has established a supply chain stabilization task force so Americans can get the supplies they need. He also announced HHS will have commercial labs prioritizing testing for hospitalized patients. And what is Speaker Pelosi doing during these days as the administration is doing those things? Well, she was introducing a counter bill to the rescue package. Just among the things that were in that bill were, one, putting emissions requirements on airlines, studying climate change, reforming our election laws. There was a whole series of strange reforms to election laws that she thought had anything to do with coronavirus, and implementing a $15 an hour minimum wage, which would just be destructive to our small businesses that we were trying to help at the time. There was all these claims that they were trying to take care of workers and families while Republicans were putting corporations first. Democrats have this strange misunderstanding of who works and how families put food on their table. They work for small businesses and they work for large businesses. And when we tell all businesses to stop, well, the best thing we can do is maintain their payrolls so that families can continue to thrive, even when they're being locked down. That's what this bill did. Nancy Pelosi refused to believe that. And of course, that lasted for days. And at the time I said, we are currently shedding jobs. I didn't have any job numbers to back it up at the time, but I figured that was probably true. Well, in hindsight, it was way more true than I ever could have imagined. In hindsight, we now know that we've lost almost 10 million jobs in a matter of weeks, which means we were literally losing millions of jobs a day while this insane delay happened, this unnecessary delay. And in the end, the backlash was severe, and the bill that we ended up passing, the $2 trillion rescue package we ended up passing, was barely different at all than the previous weekends. The small changes that were made easily would have been agreed to that weekend. Luckily, none of the really crazy stuff from Pelosi's wish list made it into the bill. Obviously, some pork did. We've dealt with that in previous podcasts as well. There is some truth to that. On March 27th, what was called the CARES Act, the $2 trillion rescue package, was signed into law by President Trump immediately. And as we record this, the first tranche of small business loans are being loaned out. It's becoming quite a popular program, and Treasury is doing a magnificent job tailoring it correctly and making sure that they're responsive to the concerns of small businesses and banks, and getting the money out to businesses so they can keep people on their payroll, and those loans get forgiven. On March 29th, President Trump announced that CDC guidelines will be extended through April 30th to promote social distancing and other measures to stop the spread. President Trump approved major disaster declarations related to the coronavirus outbreak for multiple states as well. Another sign of hypocrisy, I tweeted about this. It's when Americans only focus on the role of the president, that becomes a problem for, states' rights and our local sense of government. The governor of Michigan lambasted President Trump for weeks and weeks and weeks. Then it turns out, Michigan didn't even apply for their disaster declaration on time. That kind of thing, where's the accountability there? We have to be asking ourselves these questions. And we have to be holding the right people accountable. And after all this, after that entire timeline, as recently as this Sunday, Speaker Pelosi is going on the television shows accusing the president of denial and delay in response to the coronavirus. Now, when he made statements about the coronavirus, was he very optimistic sounding? Yes. Yes, he was. But the actions taken were, I think, the best suited for the information we had at the time. You can always look back with 2020 hindsight and say, well, this was a moment we should have done this. This is a moment we should have done this. And we should, of course, be very honest about that further in the future and look back and be better prepared for the next time. That's always how we should operate. But the bad faith finger pointing, not only is it unhelpful and disingenuous, it's both of those things. I mean, it's a disservice to the American people in the worst of ways. And I know it happens all the time. We're used to it in the political world at this point. But you would think when there's an outside enemy in facing this pandemic that we would just put it aside, the bad faith arguments for just once. You would think that we would do that. And I would say that moving into the future, this timeline can stop. This timeline of hypocrisy that I have highlighted for you, it can end. I would like to say that I have some hope for that. This week, though, Nancy Pelosi came out with some new ideas about a select committee in the House for oversight over the here and now, as she says, of coronavirus handling and how this economic response is going to occur. Of course, it's being led by, you remember, Representative Clyburn, the majority whip, who was quoted saying that he wants to use this crisis as an opportunity to implement their progressive vision. So is this going to be a good oversight committee? No, of course not. Is it really for oversight? Is it really necessary? No, of course not. Let me remind everybody, we have a committee that is designated for oversight of the administration. It happens to be called the Oversight Committee. We also have a special board, an oversight board, specifically for these loans that will be used for distressed industries in the bill that we passed. There's also a special inspector general set up. There was also extra money given to the Government Accountability Office to specifically oversee these things. To say that there's not enough oversight is just wrong. The reason for that select committee is because Democrats want to pick and choose which Americans they want to help. They do not like certain businesses. They don't like certain industries. We know that. They want some Americans to be helped. They're Americans. They don't want all Americans to be helped. That is the unfortunate truth about what's going on. But this can end. This can end. We could look to the future and end this timeline. We could look to the future and not point fingers and not try to highlight stories every time a doctor doesn't have the PPE they need. We could assume that everybody is trying to do their best to get everyone what they need, to get as many tests out there as possible, to keep innovating, to make those tests faster and better and cheaper and more prevalent, to get the supply chains going enough so that we have ventilators for everywhere across the country and enough PPE for every doctor around the country so that as we get back to normalcy, we can do so while also fighting the public health crisis and the pandemic. We can do both. But we can only do both if that timeline that I just described to you finally stops. If we assume that we all have the best of intentions and that we are all working as hard as possible to solve this, then that timeline can stop and we can fight this together. That should be the goal. Enough with the partisan, petty opportunism and finger pointing. It's disgusting. And this isn't the time for it.